Hello, hello. We are going to continue reading the Tale of Despereaux. Today, we're going to do chapters 9, 10, and 11. So a little bit less reading today, but still super fun. Chapter 9 begins on page 46, and it is called The Right Question. Here we go. The Mouse Council sent Furlough to collect Despereaux, and Furlough found his brother in the library standing on top of the great open book, his tail wrapped tightly around his feet, his small body shivering. Despereaux was reading the story out loud to himself. He was reading from the beginning so that he could get to the end, where the reader was assured that the knight and the fair maiden lived happily ever after. Despereaux wanted to read those words, happily ever after. He needed to say them aloud. He needed some assurance that this feeling he had for the Princess P, this love, would come to a good end. And so he was reading the story as if it were a spell, and the words of it, spoken aloud, could make the magic happen. "See here," said Furlough out loud to himself. He looked at his brother and then looked away. "This is just the kind of thing I'm talking about. This is exactly the kind of thing. What is he doing here, for cripe's sake? He's not eating the paper. He's talking to the paper. It's wrong, wrong, wrong." "Hey," he said to Despereaux. Despereaux kept reading. "Hey," shouted Furlough. "Despereaux, the Mouse Council wants you." "Pardon?" said Despereaux. He looked up from the book. "The Mouse Council has called you to sit with them." "Me?" said Despereaux. "You." "Oh, I'm busy right now," said Despereaux, and he bent his head again to the open book. Furlough sighed. "Geez," he said, "cripes. Nothing makes sense to this guy. Nothing. I was right to turn him in. He's sick." Furlough crawled up the chair leg and then hopped onto the book. He sat next to Despereaux. He tapped him on the head. Once. Twice. "Hey," he said, "the Mouse Council isn't asking. They're telling. They're commanding. You have to come with me right now." Despereaux turned to Furlough. "Do you know what love is?" he said. "Huh?" "Love." Furlough shook his head. "You're asking the wrong question," he said. "The question you should be asking is why the Mouse Council wants to see you." "There is somebody who loves me," said Despereaux, "and I love her, and that is the only thing that matters to me." "Somebody who loves you, somebody who loves you, what difference does that make? What matters is that you're in a lot of trouble with the Mouse Council." "Her name," said Despereaux, "is P." "What?" "The person who loves me. Her name is P." "Cripes," said Furlough. "You're missing the whole point of everything here. You're missing the point of being a mouse. You're missing the point of being called to sit with the Mouse Council. You've got to come with me. It's the law. You've been called." Despereaux sighed. He reached out and touched the words "fair maiden" in the book. He traced them with one paw, and then he put his paw to his mouth. "Cripes," said Furlough. "You're making a fool of yourself. Let's go." "I honor you," whispered Despereaux. "I honor you." And then, reader, he followed Furlough over the book and down the chair leg and across the library floor to the waiting Mouse Council. He allowed his brother to lead him to his fate. Chapter 10 is Good Reasons. The entire mouse community, as instructed by the most very honored head mouse, had gathered behind the wall of the castle ballroom. The members of the Mouse Council sat atop 3 bricks piled high, and spread out before them was every mouse, old and young, foolish and wise, who lived in the castle. They were all waiting for Despereaux. "Make way," said Furlough. "Here he is. I've got him. Make way." Furlough pushed through the crowd of mice. Despereaux clung to his brother's tail. "There he is," the mice whispered. "There he is. He's so small. They say he was born with his eyes open." Some of the mice pulled away from Despereaux in disgust, and others, thrill seekers, reached out to touch him with a whisker or a paw. The princess put a finger on him. They say he sat at the foot of the king. "It is simply not done," came the distinctive voice of Despereaux's Aunt Florence. Make way, shouted Furlough. "I have him right here. I have Despereaux Tilling, who has been called to sit with the Mouse Council." He led Despereaux to the front of the room. "Honored members of the Mouse Council," shouted Furlough, "I have brought you Despereaux Tilling, as you requested, to sit with you." He looked over his shoulder at Despereaux. "Let go of me," Furlough said. Despereaux dropped Furlough's tail. He looked up at the members of the Mouse Council. His father met his gaze and then shook his head and looked away. Despereaux turned and faced the sea of mice. "To the dungeon!" a voice cried out. "Straight to the dungeon with him." Despereaux's head, which had been full of such delightful phrases as "happily ever after" and "lovely ears" and "I honor you," suddenly cleared. "Straight to the dungeon," another voice shouted. "Enough," said the most very honored head mouse. "This trial will be conducted in an orderly fashion. We will act civilized." He cleared his throat. He said to Despereaux, "Son, turn and look at me." Despereaux turned. He looked up and into the head mouse's eyes. They were dark eyes, deep and sad and frightened. And looking into them, Despereaux's heart thudded once, twice. "Despereaux Tilling," said the head mouse. "Yes, sir," said Despereaux. "We, the 14 members of the Mouse Council, have discussed your behavior. First, we will give you a chance to defend yourself against these rumors of your egregious acts. Did you or did you not sit at the foot of the human king?" "Oh, I did," said Despereaux. "But I was listening to the music, sir. I was there to hear the song that the king was singing." "To hear the what?" "The song, sir. He was singing a song about the deep purple falling over Sleepy Garden walls." The head mouse shook his head. "Whatever you are talking about is beside the point. The question is this, and only this. Did you sit at the foot of the human king?" "I did, sir." The community of mice shifted their tails and paws and whiskers. They waited. "And did you allow the girl human, the princess, to touch you?" "Her name is P." "Never mind her name. Did you allow her to touch you?" "Yes, sir," said Despereaux. "I let her touch me. It felt good." A gasp arose from the assembled mice. Despereaux heard his mother's voice. "Mon Dieu! It is not the end of the world. It was a touch. What of it?" "It is simply not done," came Aunt Florence's voice from the crowd. "To the dungeon," said a mouse in the front row. "Silence!" roared the most very honored head mouse. "Silence!" He looked down at Despereaux. "Do you, Despereaux Tilling, understand the sacred, never-to-be-broken rules of conduct for being a mouse?" "Yes, sir," said Despereaux. "I guess so, but—" "Did you break them?" "Yes, sir," said Despereaux. He raised his voice. "But I broke the rules for good reasons, because of music and because of love." "Love?" said the head mouse. "Oh, cripes," said Furlough. "Here we go." "I love her, sir," said Despereaux. "We are not here to talk about love. This trial is not about love. This trial is about you being a mouse," shouted the most very honored head mouse from high atop the bricks, "and not acting like one." "Yes, sir," said Despereaux. "I know." "No, I don't think you do know. And because you do not deny the charges, you must be punished. You are to be sent, as ancient castle mouse law decrees, to the dungeon. You are being sent to the rats." "That's right," shouted a mouse in the crowd. "That's the ticket." The dungeon. The rats. Despereaux's small heart sank all the way to the tip of his tail. There would be no light in the dungeon, no stained glass windows, no library, and no books. There would be no Princess P. "But first," said the most very honored head mouse, "we will give you the chance to renounce your actions. We will allow you to go to the dungeon with a pure heart." "Renounce?" "Repent. Say that you are sorry you sat at the foot of the human king. Say that you are sorry that you allowed the human princess to touch you. Say that you regret those actions." Despereaux felt hot, and then cold, and then hot again. Renounce her? Renounce the princess? "Mon Dieu!" shouted the mother. "Son, do not act the fool. Renounce, repent." "What say you?" Despereaux tilling. I say, "No," whispered Despereaux. "What?" said the head mouse. "No," said Despereaux. And this time he was not whisper. He did not whisper the word. "I am not sorry. I will not renounce my actions. I love her. I love the princess." There was a bellow of collective outrage. The whole of the mouse community surged toward Despereaux. The mice seemed to become one angry body with hundreds of tails and thousands of whiskers and one huge hungry mouth opening and closing and opening and closing, saying over and over again, "To the dungeon, to the dungeon, to the dungeon." The words pounded through Despereaux's body with each beat of his heart. "Very well," said the most very honored head mouse. "You will die, then, with a black heart. Threadmaster," he called, "bring out the thread." Despereaux marveled at his own bravery. He admired his own defiance. And then, reader, he fainted. Chapter 11 is called "The Threadmaster Cometh." When Despereaux came to, he heard the drum. His father was beating a rhythm that had much more boom and much less tat. Together, Lester and the drum produced an ominous sound that went something like this: boom, 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 tap, boom, 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 tap. "Make way for the thread," cried a mouse who was pushing a wooden spool of red thread through the crowd. "Make way for the thread." Boom, boom, tap went the drum. "To the dungeon," shouted the mice. Despereaux lay on his back, blinking his eyes. How, he wondered, had things gone so terribly wrong? Wasn't it a good thing to love? In the story in the book, love was a very good thing. Because the knight loved the fair maiden, he was able to rescue her. They lived happily ever after. It said so in the book. They were the last words on the page. Happily ever after. Despereaux was certain that he had read exactly those words time and time again. Lying on the floor with the drum beating and the mice shouting and the threadmaster calling out, "Make way, make way," Despereaux had a sudden chilling thought. Had some other mouse eaten the words that spoke the truth? Did the knight and the fair maiden really not live happily ever after? Reader, do you believe that there is such a thing as happily ever after? Or like Despereaux, have you too begun to question the possibility of happy endings? "Happily ever after," whispered Despereaux. "Happily ever after," he said again as the spool of thread came to a stop beside him. "The thread, the thread, the thread," murmured the mice. "I'm sorry," said the mouse behind the spool, "but I have to ask you to stand up. I have to do my job." Despereaux got slowly to his feet. "On your hind legs, please," said the threadmaster. "It's the rules." Despereaux stood on his hind legs. "Thank you," said the mouse. "I appreciate it." While Despereaux watched, the threadmaster unwound a length of red thread from the spool and tied a loop. "Just enough for the neck," muttered the mouse. No more, no less. That's what the last threadmaster taught me. Enough thread for the neck. He looked up at Despereaux and then back down at the loop of thread. And you, my friend, have a small neck. The threadmaster raised his arms and put them around Despereaux's neck. He leaned in close, and Despereaux smelled celery. He could feel the threadmaster's breath in his ear as he worked at tightening the thread. Is she beautiful? The threadmaster whispered. What? Said Despereaux. Shh, is the princess beautiful? The Princess P? Yes. Oh, she is lovely beyond all imagining, said Despereaux. Just right, the threadmaster said. He drew back. He nodded his head. A lovely princess, just so, like a fairy tale. And you love her as a knight loves a maiden. You love her with a courtly love, a love that is based on bravery and courtesy and honor and devotion. Just so. How do you know that? Despereaux said. How do you know about fairy tales? Shh. The mouse leaned in close, and Despereaux smelled celery again, green and alive. Be brave, friend, whispered the threadmaster. Be brave for the princess. And then he stepped back and turned and shouted, Fellow mice, the thread has been tied. The thread has been knotted. A roar of approval went up from the crowd. Despereaux squared his shoulders. He made a decision. He would do as the threadmaster had suggested. He would be brave for the princess, even if, reader, could it be true, there was no such thing as happily ever after. And that's the end of today's reading. I will see you next time.